When I was a young teenager in South Australia, I had my first taste of what was called Chinese food. It's not really the food they serve in China, but it's close enough for a teenager in the 1960s, and I really liked it. It was very, very different from the food I was used to at home and from the occasional restaurant we went to. And I remember saying to my father, "My goodness, this is so delicious. I will never tire of Chinese food," which is true if you change the scenario. I mean, I don't like westernized Chinese food very much, but I do like food in China. But I said this to my father, and he said, "Well, yes, but don't ever go to a Japanese restaurant. They serve cold rice and cold raw fish." And I remember thinking at the time, "Oh, that's horrible. I don't ever want to eat that." Now, I didn't even think about how I ate cold rice pudding. Eating cold rice was not intrinsically terrible. It's just that the rice that I was normally used to from the occasional rice at home when my father cooked curry with rice, or the rice in Chinese restaurants, it's always hot. So the idea of just plain rice cold struck me as pretty awful. Well, I now know that cold rice and cold raw fish is delightful. Cold raw fish by itself is delightful, and I make both all the time. My father didn't mention that the cold rice used for sushi has vinegar in it, or that might have put me off even more. So cold rice with vinegar, no. But it leads me to today's chameleon cook. What do you cook that is normally hot that you could also serve cold? Well, let's start thinking about that. I can start by saying that just about anything that you serve hot, you can also serve cold. And the reason I say that now is that I very, very frequently cook more than I need for a single meal. And I put it in the refrigerator, and then the second day I may heat it back up, or I may eat it cold. It just depends on what I feel like. And of course, I live in the tropics. Here in Phnom Penh, it's always going to be in the 30s Celsius, that is high 80s, low 90s in the Fahrenheit range during the day, so that something cold is always welcome. So I'm just as likely to eat a soup or a stew cold as I am to eat the things that we can more normally decide whether we want to eat them hot or cold. So let's just think for a minute about pasta or about noodles, if we want to get away from the Italian notion of pasta. Well, in Japan, they serve soba noodles cold all the time. They either serve them in a cold broth, or else they serve them with a cold broth as a dipping sauce, and they serve them chilled just fine. One thing that you've got to remember, very, very, very important, is that food that has exactly the same ingredients can taste markedly different when it's hot and when it's cold. And that also means that when you serve it cold, you sometimes have to do a little adjusting to the taste palette in order to make it more interesting. Just think about beer, for example, for a minute. When I drank, used to occasionally drink the beers that are produced in the United States, notably Budweiser. Now, Budweiser has to be served ice cold, and the reason is the taste is horrible. But if you serve it ice cold, then the taste pretty much disappears. But if you're brave enough, buy a can of Budweiser, leave it at room temperature, and then drink it. I mean, maybe you'll like it, but I certainly didn't. But European beers are designed to be drunk either at room temperature or at cellar temperature. It's a mistake to think that they are served warm. They're not served warm. They're served at below room temperature typically, but not chilled. And so the taste palette has to be very different from a beer that's served ice cold. So that's your first important lesson, that everything is different when it's hot and when it's cold. You may have to add more spices and herbs or seasonings in order to give it more flavor if it's cold than if it's hot. That's lesson number one. Lesson number two, I can't think of anything, and I don't have a comment section so you can't reply. I can't think of anything that I will not eat cold. But now, let me be clear. There are three possibilities. There's hot, and usually when I say hot, I mean piping hot. There's warm, which can include room temperature. And then there's cold. Now, mostly what I want to focus on here is cold. That means chilled or frozen. And that's a whole different spectrum of tastes. Now, let's get started with this dish that I made a few days ago. It's chicken soup with some chicken in it, a few Asian mushrooms, and elbow macaroni. Very nice hot. I spiced it up only with parsley, and that was just fine. And I put half in the refrigerator because it was too much for me. And the next day, turned it out, here it is, and decided, what am I going to do with it? Well, I could put it back on the stove, heat it up, and that would be fine. But I decided, no, I'll eat it chilled. And what I did was I divided out the solids from the broth. And the solids make what you could call, perhaps in Italian, pasta primavera. Pasta primavera is cooked pasta that's served chilled with cooked vegetables, sometimes also with meat, but it can just be vegetables. And that's what I did with it. At this point, though, you have a decision to make, because when you serve it hot, it's all ready to go. It's got its herbs and its seasonings and what have you in it. Just heat it up, put it in a bowl, lap it up. When you serve it cold, you need to do something with it, otherwise it's going to be a bit bland. Now, typically I would put extra virgin olive oil on it, but it's not my favorite. My favorite is lemon juice and capers. I could also put a Japanese condiment on it called shichimi, which is a lot of different spices, including hot pepper, sesame, what have you. I do that too. So there's an abundance of ways to dress cold pasta. And you have to decide what suits you the best, or what suits the combination that you have. Certainly extra virgin olive oil, you'll never go wrong. Or a combination like a vinaigrette, extra virgin olive oil, lemon juice. I generally prefer lemon juice to vinegar, although I sometimes use rice vinegar. And then maybe oregano or parsley or what have you. That's a delightful dish. Okay, well that's the pasta part. Now the broth. And what I decided to do with the broth is freeze it and make something like a sorbet. I put it in the freezer for a few hours. Didn't want to have it rock solid. I'll talk about that in a second. I wanted to have it chilled and mostly frozen, and here you can see what it looks like when it's been in for a couple of hours, at least in my freezer. And break it up with a fork, and it's all ready to serve, or you can add maybe some chives or some fresh parsley or what have you, and it makes a really refreshing first soup of the dinner. Now, I put it back in the refrigerator, the freezer, after I had done all this, and because I wasn't ready to eat it, and it turned it rock solid. Well, that's sort of a mistake, but not really, because all you have to do, if it's absolutely a brick, is put it in a zip-top bag, get out a mallet, smash it up, and it's ready to serve. Either way is just fine. You just need to break up the solid chunks because they'll be too crunchy. You want to have it more grainy, like the grains of sand. So to conclude, I'm going to do a simple demonstration here of my general point that if you eat it hot, you can eat it cold. I've got here an egg which I've just beaten up, nothing else. A pan which I'm heating a little bit of oil in, and I'm going to make a small omelette. Just tip the egg into the pan, swivel it round a bit so that it's reasonably thin, have it cook all the way through, then roll it up and put it in the refrigerator. Chill it, and then you can do various things. You can cut it into strips or into bite-sized pieces or what have you. Maybe you can add some condiment to it or just eat it plain, as I did. It's all the same. It's a food that you would normally eat hot, but instead you chill. Now on Friday I'm going to be talking about change again. Meanwhile, if you like this video, tell your friends, like and subscribe, and I'll see you on Friday.